So thank you all very much for coming to this, which is our fifth of 6 events in collaboration with the Anglo-Russian Research Network. The Anglo-Russian Research Network recently started again after a hiatus, and they're a kind of academic group based in Exeter, I think, of which our speaker today is a convener, and they are currently looking for submissions for book talks and reading groups, and I think seminars as well. So the details for getting in touch are on Pushkin House's website, or the event pages for these events. Tonight's event is, we're very pleased to welcome Nick Hall, who is a PhD student at Exeter and who deals mostly with British travellers to the USSR. We'll be talking about that and how those fellow travellers and tourists and other visitors to the USSR conceptualized the Soviet city and countryside and the state of the USSR in general. So without much further ado, I'll hand you over to Nick Hall. Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Rafi. I'll just share my screen for the obligatory PowerPoint. Bum, bum, bum. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. So, yes, thank you, Rafi. Thank you to Pushkin House. Thank you to my colleagues, Anna and Ben in the Anglo-Russian Research Network. If you are interested in the Anglo-Russian Research Network, as Rafi says, there is information on the Pushkin House website, and we have our own website, which you'll find if you Google. And we are looking to put on many more events like this in future, hopefully. So, on to my presentation. The other side of the picture, Soviet city and countryside in 1930s British travel accounts. So, my work looks at British travellers in the Soviet Union in the 1930s via study of their travel accounts and other papers relating to their experiences. I look at these travellers' search for truth about the Soviet world and their engagement with ideas of Soviet cultural diplomacy and their understandings of the Soviet reality. For some travellers, cultural diplomacy, that is, guided tours, the arranging of visas, the provision of translators and guides, cheap travel, itineraries and organised visits to farms, factories and other institutions, were seen as a boon, a useful aid in ascertaining the nature of the new Soviet world, something many foreigners were interested in at the time. For others, cultural diplomacy was seen as a nuisance or even actively detrimental to a search for truth. It is important to note here that this wasn't necessarily a matter of political loyalties or pro-anti-Soviet views necessarily. Some pro-Soviet travellers resented the tour, while some of the more anti-Soviet travellers found the tour helpful in some sense. Fundamentally, however, and this is key, I look most closely at travellers who sought an experience of the Soviet Union away from the tour. One significant way they did this was to explore the Soviet countryside, seeking what some called an unofficial experience, as opposed to the official experience of the official Soviet story, as it were, as they saw it exemplified in things like the tour. That is, they sought in the countryside what they thought of as a truthful story. Thus, I term these writers travellers, not tourists, because they explicitly avoided the tour. Sometimes they did go on tour and then they left the tour, other times they completely avoided. But traveller is the term I use rather than tourist. In particular, today I will talk about how some of these British travellers conceptualized the Soviet city and the Soviet countryside in terms of their seeking the truth of Soviet affairs. In a diary of a visit to the Soviet Union in the autumn of 1930, Henry Devenish Harben, a Fabian barrister, wrote, "We also arranged to spend 3 or 4 days on an excursion to some provincial town and have chosen Nizhny Novgorod, his spelling, not mine, for several reasons. The Don Basin and Caucasus, where great economic activity now exists, and there is so much to see, is too far away for the time at our disposal. Kiev has been strongly recommended by all our Soviet friends, because probably it is very prosperous, and they think it will make a good impression. On the other hand, they've all tried to stave us off Nizhny, saying it is poor, there is nothing to see, the hotel is not good, and so on. We think it will be a wholesome antidote to our present enthusiasm to see a provincial town off the main line where nothing particular is doing, and we hope there to see something of the reverse side of the picture, if it exists, as the enemies of the regime assure us it does. Harben, whose privately published diary reveals a generally favourable view of Soviet affairs, states explicitly the need to travel around the Soviet Union to get an impression beyond, in his case, Moscow, the capital. Whilst he visited Nizhny on tour, this quote sets the tone for my talk today. This reverse side, the other side of a picture, that is something that wasn't Moscow or Leningrad, as being something key, and that picture, this picture being located in places less visited, less exalted than those many foreigners were shown. And in this quote, you have the idea of the Soviets wanting to show off the best of their country rather than the worst. Well, not the worst, at least the not best. And the traveller thinking, no, I'd like to see what I want to see, thank you very much, and I will travel to do that. Before we go further, however, I think it worth digging into some of the underlying concepts and context that Harben and others travelled in. As I mentioned, I look at travellers who sought to avoid the tour, and I consider their travel accounts for what they present to us, how and why they sought a truth of Soviet life, and how this related to their conceptualizations and experiences of Soviet people, places, and ideas. Generally speaking, those who experienced the USSR in this way did so by choice. It was a conscious approach to exploring or traveling around the Soviet Union, was to travel independently as possible, sorry. All these travelers were aware of cultural diplomacy. It was a very significant and very weighty, perhaps overly weighty, considering its logistical capabilities, presence in the discourse. Thus, there was an understanding that the Soviets wanted to present something to foreigners and that this would necessarily be particular. Indeed, the fame of Soviet cultural diplomacy was very apparent in the West. The first ever Tintin story from Hergé, for instance, was about Tintin in the Soviet Union, wherein he uncovered all manner of awful plots and was shadowed by assassins and spies at every turn. And this panel from around the middle of his story, which is the most preposterous series of events you can imagine, shows him discovering very, very clearly Soviet deceit, essentially. It is the workings of the infamous Potemkin village, where factories are in fact smoke from straw fires, things like that. So we have this very powerful idea of cultural diplomacy, that the Soviets are wanting to show foreigners something very particular and something possibly indicative of deceit even. That's one very big influence in the minds of these travelers. Another very big influence is the fact of all the other travelers publishing their accounts about the Soviet Union. There were many available readings and competing stories of experiences in the Soviet Union. And these concluded variously that it was an admirable place, that it was diabolical, or more commonly, that it was interesting, troubling, provocative, inspiring in some sense, and worrying in others. These two influences, the sort of weight of different views and the weight of Soviet cultural diplomacy, combined to mean that when travelers visited the Soviet Union on what we might call a mission of discovery, they were aware of dissenting opinions, their own and those of their contemporaries, and how Soviet cultural diplomacy sought to shape their opinion. The travel writer and art critic, Robert Byron, helpfully summarizes for us both the scene on the ground in terms of the traveler and cultural diplomacy, and also the way that seeking travel away from the tour could elevate a traveler's mission of exploration and discovery. This is not to say, as so many people infer, that the visitor is only shown what the authorities want him to see. On the contrary, free movement within Russia today entails fewer formalities than before the revolution. The advantage of the conducted tours is simply their remarkable cheapness. And since they are very conveniently conducted, the tourist is naturally treated to the showpieces of the existing regime. But as these seem to me, even by anticipation, both extremely uninteresting and fundamentally insignificant, I trusted to my own arrangements and may here take the opportunity of thanking those who helped me make them. Traveling was consequently more difficult, but equally more entertaining. That is, traveling off tour was better, essentially, in the eyes of someone like Byron and in the eyes of many other travelers at the time, and also that it was possible. I think, if I may say, I think there's still an idea, possibly, that travel in the Soviet Union was extremely difficult, and in some senses it was. It wasn't always particularly comfortable, But what is apparent from just looking through some of the historiography, but also just these primary sources, is how many people traveled off tour, how many people made their own arrangements, how many people did things which are really quite surprising, some of which I'll get to. And so the idea that even as travelers, curious thing about this though is even as travelers approach the Soviet Union with this knowledge, knowing that they could, if they tried hard enough, travel off tour, travel independently, the introductions to their books are full of discussions about how A, people were telling them it was terribly dangerous, and B, them saying, I am going to do this. I'm going to travel independently because so I can tell the truth in some sense, as if nobody had done it before. And so it's a sort of continual cycle of people looking to subvert expectations, and in doing so, actually really fitting in with everybody else. Beyond these two ideas of cultural diplomacy and competing views of foreigners, there was the idea of the Soviet person, the Soviet worker, the peasant, and their role in Soviet life. Another quote serves to illustrate the levels of meaning at work here. Whilst aboard a boat to Leningrad in 1934, a trade unionist from South Shields, John Brown, listened to a speech by Sidney Webb, made to their fellow passengers. The Fabian related the story of Lady Astor's visit to Russia. Lady Astor asked a worker if he was happy. He said he was. She then said he could not be happy as he could not denounce the government. But the worker replied, I don't wish to denounce the government. Here are several issues that my work explores and into which this dichotomy of city and countryside fits. First, there is Lady Astor as the foreigner, asking questions of the Soviet worker, hoping to discover something essential about Soviet life, exemplifying the ostensible objective of much of this travel. Then there is her doubting of the worker's reply because of the ideologically charged context in which the interaction occurs. Denouncing the government is quite a political act, and it's something that apparently Lady Astor expected the worker would want to make, but could not because of, the powers that be. Indeed, her expectation of this being the sincere response of the worker. Then there is the worker's protest apparently being misread, this questioning of his sincerity. Actually, he is his own agent, thank you very much. Then there is Webb relating the story to fellow tourists on the boat to Leningrad as a way of showing how jaundiced foreign readings of the Soviet Union could be, in this case, particularly against the Soviet Union, implying that all the workers wanted to denounce the government but could not. And Webb is, suggesting Lady Astor expects that, and therefore it doesn't give a fair appraisal to the possibility of Soviet workers supporting the system. And then there is Brown relating the whole episode to his readers as a way of showing how his fellow passengers considered their experiences and deployed such anecdotes in politically, culturally meaningful ways. If we are aware of ourselves, Webb was saying, we can find the truth. Finally, Brown himself is potentially implying, I am aware of this complexity, these layers of stories and feelings about Soviet life, and thus I can find the truth myself. So whilst I won't go into the complexities of all this stuff in great detail, it's important, I think, that the city and countryside dichotomy fits in here. It's all about seeking a truth and trying to gauge where you'd find that, who you talk to find that. This is a real driving desire of many travelers, even as they did it in very different ways. Indeed, some actually did not travel to Russia, so we can't call them travelers, but they purported to tell the truth. Some did not travel to Russia, as the Soviet Union was often called by foreigners, because of all this complexity and doubt about Soviet cultural diplomacy. Ernest Benn, a publisher, wrote a book called About Russia, in which he made it clear that the only fair view of Soviet life could be made as far as possible from Soviet cultural diplomacy, that is, from outside the borders of the USSR entirely. However, fortunately for me, plenty of people did wish and did indeed travel to the Soviet Union, and there's evidence of a certain confidence on the part of these travelers. Whilst many voiced doubts about their ability to adequately explain Soviet life on the basis of a few weeks' travel, there is a confidence born of an empirical or romantic experience, seeking both empirical and romantic experiences, witnessing with one's own eyes and senses and one's own intuition and cognitive faculties, I guess, that underpins all their work. And this is true even of travelers who didn't speak any Russian. They still went, not knowing any Russian, to try and learn from Russian people what the truth was, or what they could discern as the truth by observing Russian people, by having translations made for them, not necessarily by in-tourist translators, but by other people at times. Of course, some travelers damned those who traveled without Russian. So there's a whole knotty little tangle of expectations and understandings there. But broadly speaking, even as travelers voiced doubt about their ability, they still went, they still traveled, and they still published. They still said something about the Soviet Union. The mining expert Malcolm Burr, in his book In Bolshevik Siberia from 1931, neatly encapsulates this confidence along with awareness of the discourse that surrounded and was performed/embodied by travelers to the Soviet Union. One modest virtue, at least this work claims, none too common in modern books of travel: it is all true. How did travelers go about finding what they sought? Where would they go? What would they see? Who would they see? A helpful, if extremely simple device comes from the travel writer Archibald Lyle. He wrote of how he would have been rather more impressed with the Soviet world if he had spoken to a single unofficial Russian who wasn't fed to the teeth with the whole business. Immediately, we see a division between the idea of an unofficial Soviet world and an official one. Cultural diplomacy sits in the latter, along with the secret police, the party, Stalin, propaganda, and so on. In the former is a concept of a people somehow distinct from this group, this power, this influence. He was not alone in making this distinction between some kind of official and unofficial world. The journalist Gareth Jones is very relevant here. Jones, the subject of the film Mr. Jones from earlier this year, visited the Soviet Union 3 times, in 1930, 31, and 33. His diaries are a key source for this history, as are his articles. In the Times in 1931, he referred to a real Russia that was not the world created by the Soviet government. The Soviet world was seen to be a place, therefore, characterized by dichotomies for travelers. First, there was a divide between Soviet and foreigner. There was an iron curtain, in the words of Patrick Wright, placed between foreigners and the subject of their curiosity. That is, cultural diplomacy sought to shape foreign opinion and to limit, it was seen, foreign explorations of the Soviet world. But also there was a divide within the Soviet Union, it was perceived, between this official world and the unofficial world. Not all writers and travelers subscribe to this. I must stress this is a particular reading of some of the travelers. Not every book you read will display this, but it's a significant one, I think. Neither did all the travelers do this in quite the same way. But I think it's definitely worth talking about, and enough travelers engage with it. And it's also, again, important to note that even those pro-Soviet travelers could explore this dichotomy themselves. It wasn't simply the matter that anti-Soviet travelers saw a divide between rulers and ruled, sort of tyranny on one hand and oppressed peoples on the other. Even pro-Soviet writers could explore differences and dichotomies in Soviet life. And the writer philanthropist Ada Chesterton is probably the clearest example of this, as I will talk about in a bit. So, the novelist Elizabeth Delafield summarized the meaning of this combination of geographical and cultural differences, this combination of geographical and cultural differences had for travelers. I wish one could talk to the old people, or the people living in remote villages, or the few remaining white Russians. This, i.e., the who and the where of the unofficial world were connected. This is true for many travelers. Broadly speaking, in seeking to explore these dichotomies, some travelers saw the countryside as less official, and thus the place to visit if one could, traveling off tour, not on tour, being the best way to do so. So, despite the focus on the countryside, I don't just want to talk about the countryside. The city is very important here too. The conceptualization of the city is really, really key as well. Different kinds of cities too. So the Soviet city was nearly always experienced first by travelers, other than border crossings on the train from Poland and Germany, which is where most people went by boat from London to Leningrad, or by train from Poland up to Moscow. Some went in other ways, which we can talk about later maybe. Most ended up, the first proper experience they had of the Soviet Union other than border control was in Moscow or Leningrad. So the Soviet city was nearly always the first impression foreigners had of the Soviet Union. Despite this, The idea that the sense of truth being somewhere beyond Moscow and Leningrad was really common. The General Secretary of the Trades Union Congress, Walter Citrine, regretfully noted in 1936 that many peasants lived in districts remote and inaccessible to the ordinary visitor, and how English journalists told him that he needed to leave the cities to understand more about the Soviet Union. Archibald Lyle implied the requirement to leave the main cities to understand Soviet affairs too, trying to explain to a puzzled Russian intellectual why foreigners praise the Soviet government by saying that such foreigners rarely left Moscow, and when they did, they were shepherded on tour. Violet Conolly, perhaps best described as an early Sovietologist, she later headed the Russian section, the Russian Research Department at the Foreign Office, I think post-Second World War, wrote of the isolation of foreign journalists in the capital. The Moscow correspondents of the world press are securely muzzled by the fear of expulsion, and their dots on the I's of Soviet construction are inevitably erased by the censor. The travel writer Nora Rowan Hamilton observed that the further from the cities of Moscow and Leningrad, the closer one got to seeing through the veil shrouding this dark secret of an opposition movement. She wrote of hearing of stories of there being opposition in the countryside, as in political opposition, active political opposition to the Soviet government. Thus, she's referring to essentially the violence of collectivization and purges, which revealed the tensions between what we might say is the center and the periphery. Again, these terms are complicated by the process of collectivization, but generally speaking, the idea that there is, again, something going on beyond the city, which is more telling about Soviet life than anything else. What next? Gareth Jones spoke and wrote about foreign correspondents based in Moscow more vitriolically. He was thinking of those like his particular foe, the New York Times journalist Walter Duranty. He described these journalists as being masters of euphemism and understatement and submitting to censorship, whilst cities and towns of Soviet Russia are isolated or a small minority of the population. They are not the real Russia. The real Russia for Jones was thus the countryside of the peasantry. An echo of sort of Stephen Graham's assessments of Russian life pre-revolution, albeit crucially filtered through an understanding of Soviet context and imperatives rather than those of Holy Russia. However, the first thing to be said here before following these travelers into the countryside is that the city could easily and frequently did exhibit unofficial life to many travelers. Indeed, a German agronome named Braun told Archibald Lyle that he should visit the markets of Rostov and Kiev to see most illuminating things there, which your guides won't show. Lyle himself helped a fellow traveler, a very curious communist, it so happens, who did not like the guided tour. She felt coddled the entire time, despite being a very, very strong supporter of the theory of communism, to gain information on where to go in Leningrad to see homeless children, to see the unofficial, to see the picture the Soviets didn't want the foreigner to see. It was said. These other experiences people had could encompass making acquaintances with citizens entirely free of Soviet guides, finding, visiting people's houses. John Brown climbed over a wall in Leningrad into the Putilov tractor works because he wasn't allowed to go, so he decided he would go and just climbed over the wall and walked around and had a very boring afternoon seeing nothing at all and went home. He also walked into a commissariat to have an impromptu interview with the head of the post office because he wanted to, so he just did. People were exploring these cities just as much as they did the countryside. They wondered and they probed and they questioned and they did what they could given their capabilities. Gareth Jones had numerous conversations with Soviet citizens in Moscow in their homes and in alleyways and on the street. Violet Conolly saw cold, ragged, underfed men and women selling their wares on Moscow streets. Herbert Marchant, as a schoolmaster, relates encounters in the homes of Muscovites, as Nora Rowan Hamilton. Archibald Lyle found, when walking alone in Leningrad, 105 people. He's very, very, very clear that he counted them. There were exactly 105 sleeping on the pavement. All these things were kind of seen as, generally these writers were critical of the Soviet Union, and so they were finding sort of truth. They were finding the secret. Lyle even wrote of blowing the gaff on the Soviet Union, as in exposing these horrors, exposing this suffering, which the outside world apparently didn't care about. I'll get into more of this in a bit. But the key point here is that the city was just as productive, as it were, of these experiences as the countryside. On the other hand, there were experiences which were much less negative and just as unofficial. The playwright Hubert Griffith had much unaccompanied time in Moscow, which he found the most useful way of meeting good-natured, he calls them, Soviets who reinforced his positive impressions of the Soviet Union. He walked across Moscow with a Russian architect whose quiet moderation about Soviet achievements was more impressive than any propaganda, Griffith's brain. Griffith appreciated this time because it gave me a sense, hitherto absent from the tour, so we traveled on tour and off tour, and even more valuable because of it, of meeting and mixing with a variety of people who had for years on end lived and worked and had their being under the Soviet Union. The second point about this is that even wanting to move beyond the city, the way travelers did this was different. Violet Conolly was intensely frustrated by Moscow, which she described as the chosen city of the Soviet Union, where foreigners walked about burbling, she called it, at Soviet achievements. She felt stifled there. Deeply and artificially sheltered I was from the normal stress and current of Russian life. She was also told by a man not to judge the USSR by the towns. If you want to know what the conditions are really like, go out 5 or 10 kilometers into the country. Indeed, so annoyed was she in Moscow, feeling stifled and isolated, she sought to leave the capital as soon as possible, accelerating her itinerary. There's nothing for it but to set out on my travels to Armenia, the Caucasus, in fact, anywhere at once. To leave, that is, on some kind of tour as soon as possible. And indeed, Conolly did travel on tour. But crucially for her, she traveled on trains by herself, and she traveled in so-called hard class with peasants, and she spoke fluent Russian. So her book is mainly comprises of conversations on trains with peasants and with workers who are traveling certain places in the countryside. The focus of her book is the time when she didn't have guidance, essentially. The pilot, John Grierson, who said that the best way to see a country was to fly over it, flew to the Soviet Union and landed largely unannounced at airfields near Minsk, Moscow, and Astrakhan, curious to see what he found when he landed. John Brown, who traveled alone for much of his trip, related that I selected the route that would enable me to cover the most varied expanse of Russian territory: Leningrad, Moscow, Gorky, Kazan, Samara, Saratov, Stalingrad. Some traveled, like Malcolm Burr, also alone on the Trans-Siberian Railway, exploring Omsk, Irkutsk, and the rivers and forests of Siberia. The key point here is the meaning, and it was made very clear in these books, it's a rhetorical thing, the meaning invested in the apparent diversity of locations visited. Also significant is the seeking not of the countryside itself per se, but other provincial cities too. The journalist Pratt Borman was even clearer on this. I have chosen Rostov for this first article as a typical provincial city and more true of Russia today than Leningrad or Moscow. Britishers who have only visited Leningrad and Moscow have not seen the true Russia of today, and any more than a foreigner visiting London only will have a true view of Great Britain. This message was even implied by Soviet advice to foreigners. Ilya Ehrenburg, writing in the Moscow Daily News in 1934, implored the dear tourist to go and see our people. We have so much more to show you. Besides 5 hotel directors and 50 motionless figures, there are 150 million people who work, think, and live. Ehrenburg did not directly state that the traveller should venture into the countryside, but the implication is clear. The traveller should leave the hotel and its rituals of cultural diplomacy and go and see the people, where the truth of the Soviet world was best found. The idea of difference between Moscow and Leningrad and provincial cities in the countryside was not necessarily one of stark change in condition of feeling. For example, Henry Harben and Pratt Borman do not push an idea of an unofficial so much as an alternative, a less formalized, ritualized, and more mundane Soviet life that the provincial city might contain. On the other hand, the difference could be dramatic for travelers. In 1931, Ada Chesterton avoided Leningrad and Moscow entirely, seeking a more simple method of approach, in her own words, in the Belarusian SFSR. My plan was to push across the northeast Polish frontier, straight into White Russia, with the poorest soil, but the reddest communism of any republic in the Union, and once there to follow the leadership of chance. This paid off for her. She reached Minsk with no interference from tourists. If I recall correctly, she had some trouble at the border with her visa, but she got in fine at the Polish border. Minsk and its citizens, however, were very, very displeasing to Chesterton. Minsk's mean streets, tumble-down houses, huge squares flanked by high buildings, paintless and scarred with cracks, were stamped with desolation, hopelessness, and despair. Its people were ragged, dirty, and drifted in a bemused stream, their faces mournful and impassive. In the countryside, however, she concluded that conditions, from what I've heard and read, seem to be peculiarly bad in Moscow and Leningrad, to neither of which places did we, she travelled with a friend called Bunny, go. But at the end of our journey, as at the beginning, I realized that the common everyday life of millions and millions of Russians does not correspond with either the dietetic or political status of the city. And she wrote of her time in Ukraine, a little bit after her time in Belarus, that she and her friend Bunny experienced just untold joy in the countryside with the peasants. She adored it. Chesterton did not like the reverberating propaganda of the cities, and she romanticized those collective farms which she thought retained a joyous comradeship over mechanized farming. Thus, we see how even far from the cities, with no guides in sight, differences between one form of Soviet life and another are still identified. Chesterton was channeling a rhapsody about the rural ideal that echoed British discourse: cooperation over competition, community over the anonymous rule. Furthermore, her searching of the interior was framed as a statement of her sincere investigation, combating anti-Soviet rumor. The majority of foreigners are content, she wrote, usually speaking, with a visit to the larger cities. They have not the inclination to explore the interior, and as a consequence, the newspapers are full of the activities of the OGPU Inquisition, or the OGPU, as many travelers call it, so that to the uninitiated, the whole area of 8 million miles is enmeshed by a network of persecution and intrigue, and there are very few who have any desire to pierce below the surface of rumor or analyze the reactions of prejudice. I think, just to have a little aside, sorry, this is very important. Hubert Griffiths did this as well. These were travelers who were very pro-Soviet, but they traveled off tour to show, to demonstrate that one could, and one could still have a lovely time in the Soviet Union. One could explore things adequately and well in the Soviet Union. And see, you wouldn't see untold horrors, you'd see untold joys in Chesterton's words, and you'd see many, many positive things, not just negative things. So it wasn't simply about being pro or anti-Soviet, it was about exploring Soviet Union properly. It was about traveling in a more insightful way to prove that you could, or in the case of someone like Gareth Jones, to find the horrors, which I'll get to. Chesterton's experience can be compared to the experience of the novelist Elizabeth Delafield, who lived, again, alone on a communal farm in Ukraine for a time. She also traveled around generally, but the time on the farm was quite a significant part of her trip. Delafield had a far less romantic time on the farm, that while she liked several of the inhabitants, did not leave her enchanted with Soviet rural life at all, even as she thought it significant to witness the everyday workings of peasant life for herself. Rather, she spent her time observing and discussing what she could about Soviet life with the peasants there, eventually leaving when she got toothache. And when she got back to Kiev, I think it was, the local in-tourist man asked her where she'd been, and she told him, and the man said, "Why did you go there?" And they didn't tell her off, didn't demand anything, just said, "Why on earth would you go there? What did you see? What were you doing?" And Elizabeth Delafield wasn't really sure herself. So, a couple more travellers in the countryside. The experience of Charles Maitland Makgill Crichton, who I just call Crichton from here on, explored in his Russian Closeup of 1932, provides some insight into not only foreign perceptions of the dichotomies at hand, but also Soviet perceptions. This marries the tension over city and countryside as experienced by and between British and Soviet mentalities and those surrounding cultural diplomacy. Like many of the travellers already mentioned, Crichton was dissatisfied with the attitude of the many foreigners who are content to visit Moscow only, and who return full of enthusiasm for all that has been accomplished by the revolution. Let them only visit some of these smaller places and see whether their first opinion needs revising. Therefore, it is essential to avoid the illusion that certain institutions exist when they may be only the fabrication of Moscow art. So, very briefly, you can kind of see Chesterton says, go to the countryside because the city's terrible, but the countryside is beautiful, and to do so kind of confirms the possibilities and possible benefits of Soviet civilization. Maitland, Crichton's a bit more sort of, if you stay in Moscow, you're not going to see the real Soviet Union, and you might see some bad things, he's implying. So again, travel further, travel more, do more, be more inquisitive. Travel alone if you can. The curious thing is, though, is that Maitland didn't always travel alone, and we'll get to that. So in Kiev, he inquired about visiting a collective farm. He received discouragement from in-tourists, but this actually pleased him. He wrote that these apparent difficulties in reaching a farm were the most welcome that I could have wished. I now felt sure that I should see something genuine and not a mere model established and maintained for the deception of foreign visitors. However, rather than venturing alone, he arranged a visit with a guide. So he managed to get the tourist to agree that he could go to the farm with the guide. Fine. So Crichton advocated viewing smaller places, but the guide, it seems, did not figure as an instrument of the Moscow artists in his planning of the visit. Fortunately for us, the presence of the guide enables us to see how differing cultural perceptions of the countryside manifested in the British and Soviets. The guide enjoyed the experience rather less than Crichton. Offered soup at the farm's canteen, Crichton tucked in and found it very appetizing. The guide, however, took about 2 spoonfuls and left the rest, whispering to me that it was quite extraordinary what rubbish country peasants were content to consume. Crichton concluded that this was a sign of the remarkable antagonism between town and country. Indeed, it is a sign of the, to quote Michael David Fox, competitive context of culture, where cultured Soviet citizens could look down on their peasant neighbors, which in turn is indicative of the cultural aspects of collectivization. So not only the dichotomies that travelers identified were kind of replicated in reality to an extent. There was the cultural aspect of collectivization, the sort of the educating and acculturating of the peasants was a significant part of the vast process of collectivization. Crichton didn't appear to see anything particularly amiss with this, but when he later visited a hamlet of uncollectivized peasants marooned in the middle of the collective farm's vast acreage, further nuance arises. Crichton thought that they had retained something unquestionably higher in their non-collectivized state. Here was some nostalgic past writ large before him. Although he did note, rarely had he seen such poverty, he identified that contrasted to this uncollectivized hamlet, the Soviet commune had lost some kind of quiet dignity. The guide's views on the hamlet are known, but those of Pyotr Alexandrovich, a member of the commune, are. Alexandrovich made as many comparisons as he could between existence in this hamlet and in the farm to the farm's benefit, and asked Crichton what he thought of the progress the farm had made, to which Crichton offered what he termed justified praise. Herein is a complex mix of praise of rationalization and collectivization and nostalgia for a past that Crichton had no possible grasp of beyond a romantic notion of peasant dignity, and the tensions within the Soviet structure itself, embodied by Pyotr Alexandrovich and the guide. They, it would appear, had diverging opinions on the success of the farm and the significance of its peasants for Soviet culture. On a farm path, Crichton waves at the peasants who greeted him in return. His guide grumbled. His guide scoffed at this friendliness. In the towns, people do not greet you. They are far too busy. And Crichton wonders, what could Moscow mean to these peasants? What Crichton's example shows is how even within the city and countryside dichotomy, layers of significance and meaning are found. The farm is a better thing to visit than the city. The guide enjoys it less than the foreigner. And the kernel of the old ways found within that farm is still somehow spiritually supreme to all. Finally, in contrast to this alternative official scene in the countryside, Gareth Jones predicated understanding of the Soviet Union on contacting peasants, miners, and other non-party Soviets in the countryside, imbuing the idea of the unofficial Russian of Lyell's phrasing with a power and significance unmatched by most travelers. Jones wrote in 1930 of visiting the countryside alone, where he had every chance to see the real situation, where I traveled alone, walked through villages and towns, and slept in peasant homes. The Soviet foreign officials were on every occasion courteous and spared no trouble in their efforts to help me. I was able to go about freely without hindrance. This comment was followed a year later by another, from a second visit to the Soviet countryside, this time near Samara. The writer, who had no difficulty in traveling wherever he wished and wandered on foot to whatever farms he pleased, was able to gain the confidence of a large number of peasants in different parts of Russia. The unanimity of their views was striking. The real situation was that of the countryside. For Jones, this was built on engaging with workers and peasants in and around Leningrad and Moscow and other cities, but it was the peasant village that constituted the mental, physical, and spiritual core of Russian life, for Jones, as opposed to the Soviet world. The real Russia is to be found in the distant villages, never or rarely seen by the traveler. Given his visits were during the heights of collectivization and its attendant disasters and disruptions, the village and the experience of the peasant was pivotal for Jones's stories about Soviet Union. The peasant was Russian, collectivization was Soviet, and Jones felt pity to the former and outrage to the latter. nice quote from a couple of his diaries. This is, as it says, near Samara in 1931. He spent the night on a farm and woke up the next morning and had a chat. As we stood outside, the group said how terrible it was. All nodded inside. Then a komsomolka came, that is, a young pioneer. Old wives' tales, she said of grumbling. When the president of the Soviet came and the horse and cart was ready, an old woman came hobbling up. Oh, do something for me. They took away my cow, weeping. How can I live? Wails. Laughter from young komsomolka. Shut up, old woman. You ought to work. Imploring look, hand stretched out. President of the Soviet. Well, don't come bothering us now. We've got better things to do. Get off, old woman. It's a very, very stark demonstration of the dichotomy for Jones between rulers and ruled. I picked it because it's particularly evocative. There are more subtleties in his diaries as well. There's more subtleties in his history, but I think you can get the impression of why Jones thought the peasant was such an important figure in explaining what was happening in the Soviet Union. In 1931 and 1933, his diaries and articles record conversations with the peasants. So then I caught up with a bearded peasant who was walking along. His feet were covered with sacking. We started talking. He spoke in Ukrainian Russian. I gave him a lump of bread and of cheese. You couldn't buy that anywhere for 20 rubles. There just is no food. We walked along and talked. Before the war, this was all gold. We had horses and cows and pigs and chickens. Now we are ruined. We are doomed. This walk from, you can see Belgorod there and Kharkov there. He got off that train line between the two cities and had a stroll. Stroll is quite the term for this. He had a walk along the railway line down into Ukraine and spoke to many peasants, some of whom were starving. And this formed the basis of his articles about the Soviet famine, the Holodomor, in March 1933, which were published in the Times upon his return from the Soviet Union. However, even for Jones, who I think probably more than any of these travelers put the peasant at the top of the apex in terms of understanding the Soviet Union and the countryside, the deepest, darkest countryside possible. Even for him, the cities were still fecund, helpful places to visit, to understand what was going on. His diaries are full of conversations with workers and children and ex-nuns and live nuns and everyone in Moscow and Leningrad and other cities, Nizhny, Samara, Kharkov, Kiev, etc., etc., etc. So really, the city and countryside were never totally distinct from each other in every sense. Indeed, in Moscow 33, Jones talked to peasants who traveled from Ukraine up to Moscow looking for food. So the city and countryside melded, literally. Although his experiences on that railway line in Ukraine became the fundamentally significant factor for his conclusions about the Soviet Union. So, to conclude, whilst not every traveller had experiences as shocking as Jones, he embodies a conceptualization of the Soviet Union shared by others. Broadly put, British travellers sought to discover truth of the Soviet Union, and it's clear that for many this meant engaging with the Soviet towns and countryside beyond Moscow and Leningrad, because these were places less often visited by foreigners. Travellers and tourists alike ended up in many places, and I love this map, so I just want to show it. These guys, Kingsley Martin, Hubert Griffith, Henry Harben, Walter Citrine, some I've mentioned, some I've not. Most, in fact, pretty much every foreigner, no, that's wrong, not every foreigner, many foreigners were in Central European Russia. They were Leningrad, Moscow, down to the south. That was one of the very common tourist routes. And my work uses a lot of people who did travel on tour because they still had insightful thoughts about the tour and about the Soviet experience. And all the travelers I list here generally ended up in many of these places, but just to show you some of the diversity of experience. Travelers and tourists alike ended up in, as I say, European Russia, the Caucasus, the Ukraine, and traveling down the Volga. But travelers also visited the far north, Asia, Belarus, the Siberian taiga, and plenty of other places besides. So quite a geographical reach. I don't think many went to the Arctic Circle in the, Siberia, but other than that, they got around. And they did so throughout the 1930s. There's definitely a tail off after 1936, 37, but there are still books being published in 38, 39 about this. The real heyday was sort of 30, 36, 37. And many did this without guides. They did it in varying ways. They had varying experiences, but they did it without guides, which is very important for what they were trying to do, according to them, or what they told their readers. But also crucially, this exploring was also done within the cities and was possible within the cities. But the conceptual divide remained between city and countryside remained a strong presence in the discourse, even with the experience of the Soviet urban world's complexities. In traveling alone, or at least without a guide, these travelers felt they could avoid Soviet cultural diplomacy and thus avoid its distorting influence. Yet, given the nature of the Soviet Union, this was only part of the story, and I'd like to reserve very briefly a little bit of sort of irony about this. In seeking the unofficial Soviet world, these travelers sought to bypass or transcend some element of the official Soviet. If they reached the countryside, or at least the smaller cities went the logic, they'd find space away from the Soviet. Yet, as observed, the cities themselves are complex places where unofficial experiences were readily encountered, and the countryside was also, of course, the focus of much official Soviet effort. That's what a Britain might conceive of as the other side of the picture, the countryside beyond the Soviet bastion, was in fact a space and a people under immense pressure from the official ideologies, narratives, and discipline of Soviet power, most readily apparent in the vast undertaking of collectivization. Nevertheless, this dichotomy was one of the more notable organizing principles of many British travelers' appreciations of Soviet life, and I hope this talk has given you some insight into some of the complexities and meanings of this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tintin returning home from his trip. The next panel, he's greeted by a huge crowd in Brussels, saying "Long live Tintin and Snowy," of course. So,
I think this book was out of print for a very long time as well. I think it was, everybody just said it was horrifically inaccurate and didn't bother to reprint it, but I think it's recently been reprinted again now.
I have it. I can't remember when it was reprinted, but I have a modern production of it, absolutely. It was actually based on a Belgian diplomat's book called Joseph Douillet called Moscow Unmasked, which was full of high crimes and misdemeanors, essentially, about the Soviet Union is this terribly, catastrophically awful place where so many awful things are happening, and the Soviets are liars to a man. And so Hergé read this, I think, and just said, okay, that's the Soviet Union, and Tintin explored it very much in that vein.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've got loads of brilliant questions already. I'll start by asking Marina's question here. What were the key outcomes of the British travellers' visits and their main positive and negative impressions of the Soviet regimes? And have they found any advantages compared to the UK?
That's a good question. The key outcomes, I'd say, really substantively, was just the sheer weight of books that were published about the Soviet Union. So it was a sort of voracious monster that just needed more and more and more books, who all largely said many of the similar things. And the broad conclusions reached were the Soviet Union was dreadful. Essentially, it was a place of deceit, a place of catastrophe, or more subtly, that it had some good things to it, like literacy, education programs, work, full employment, work on prison reform and penal reform, so to not punish but to reintegrate criminals into society, that kind of thing. People, especially specialists in particular, British specialists, went there to look at their field in the Soviet Union, often came away quite impressed. And then there was the more eulogistic approaches, which were everything's wonderful, within reason. I'm speaking very broadly here, but one of the curious things noticeable, I think, in a lot of these conclusions was that even if something was good for the Soviet Union, it wasn't necessarily termed as good for Britain. So there was you could see something as positive in the Soviet Union, but whether you think we should do it at home was a different question. So I think in many ways the Soviet Union was treated as the great experiment of infamous phrasing, in the sense that it was seen as a kind of a laboratory for other people to come and examine and go, yes, it's interesting, I can see how that's interesting, that's very positive, that's bad. But doing it at home is a different question, and that's a much thornier topic. So that's very broadly some of the outcomes.
Yeah. Do you mind, there was the other half of my question. So it's not only the positive, the advantages of the Soviet state that I've heard a lot about, but they were traveling in the 30s, especially after 1934, where there was a peak of Stalin's purges. I just wonder whether anyone had actually sensed any fear from the people, or whether they managed to pick up some, some signs of what was happening in the country at that time. Not the achievements, but the fear. Did they experience it at all?
Absolutely. I think the clearest example, not about purges, but about great suffering, is Gareth Jones's walk in Ukraine to do with the famine. So, he identified that many people were suffering. And then on the political side, say with the purges, he taught Jones and other travelers, not just Jones, talked to people who knew of people who'd been exiled from the village. They'd been sent to Siberia, or whole families, Kulak families sent away. There were some Soviet people who, briefly, one of the problems I have in these travel accounts is that if a Soviet person was truly, afraid of, talking to a foreigner because of the potential implications there might be of talking to a foreigner about bad things in the Soviet Union, they don't turn up in the travel accounts because by definition they didn't talk to a foreigner. However, there are people who tell many stories of either they question the foreigner and say, "Are you a spy? Can I talk to you? Are you dangerous?" And then more commonly actually is people saying, "Yes, it's terrible," or "It's good, but there's some bad things happening." Violet Conolly's on a train, I think to Baku, and she talks to a woman who mentions the name of Karl Radek, and Karl Radek has just been arrested, and she realizes that she mentioned Karl Radek and shuts up and doesn't say anything else for the rest of the train journey. So that's a very clear example of persona non grata. Just don't talk about certain topics, and do talk about certain topics, because there could, in the very next page, Violet Conolly could talk to someone else, a party member, I can't remember his name, on a train, who asked for her address so that he could send letters to her when she was back in Britain. So there's a very strange mix of, or perhaps not strange, but a very complicated mix of horror stories and real tales of real suffering, and people really not wanting to talk to foreigners. Gareth Jones talked to a doctor on a boat on the Volga who just would not answer his questions at all. Jones asked him about nationalism, which is a very tricky topic in the Soviet Union, and the doctor said, just didn't answer. He just talked about other things. So Jones said, "There must be nationalists in the Caucasus," and the doctor said, "The mountains there are very beautiful." And Jones said, "Well, what about Ukraine?" He said, "Oh, those fields of, the fields of wheat are very beautiful." That's all he would say. And then you'd have someone pouring their heart out to Jones, a day later, about the famine or about the fact their church had closed or something like that. There's a very complex mix of things encountered.
We have a related question on that from Jane, who says that apart from Gareth Jones and his visit to Ukraine, very few of the travellers mentioned seem to be aware of the famine in Ukraine and elsewhere, or supposed peasant resistance. Is that correct?
It's a good question, actually, because it's curious. Malcolm Muggeridge was the other journalist who reported on the famine. So, but if you look at the works after 1933, so after these reports came out in spring 1933, such as, say, Elizabeth Delafield, who published a book in 34-35 in Ukraine, she doesn't mention the famine at all, which is really peculiar, actually. And often the crimes or the catastrophes of the Soviet Union, such as they are described, are referred to generally rather than specifically. So it's sort of, we know bad things happen here, but I'm going to go and see for myself. It's a very good point. It's really quite curious that the famine doesn't crop up as a sort of very obvious, conscious, articulated point. That Delafield, for instance, is on a farm in Ukraine. I think it's more in the western part of Ukraine than the eastern part of Ukraine. There's this slight difference, but it's very strange.
It is quite odd. I mean, do you think there was a kind of active part on the part of the regime to funnel people towards, like in the Tintin fashion, more well-off farms to avoid this kind of question? Or
it was, absolutely, but Delafield wasn't funneled anywhere. She travelled where she wanted to. So I think there's a really complicated point about the discourse about the Soviet Union at the time, which I'll try and articulate. It's something I've been grappling with for a couple of years, how to sort of articulate it. But in a sense, for a lot of these people, it didn't, even though they said they were going to see for themselves and they're going to experience something, What mattered more ultimately was what they already thought, and that's been articulated in historiography quite a lot. But more generally, I think Delafield makes a very, very big point of this. There were so many competing views and understandings of the Soviet Union that she'd read about and was familiar with, that she found her experience no more enlightening than having been back in London. She had a very interesting time, but in terms of understanding what was actually going on, she felt all at sea. Despite that, though, news of things like famine being absent is very, very strange. And yes, the Soviets, cultural diplomacy, of course, sought to funnel foreigners to prosperous farms. Of course they did. But the point here is that lots of travelers that was irrelevant to lots of travelers, other than they knew it happened, therefore they wanted to somehow subvert it or circumvent it.
It's interesting that you mentioned that what the sort of major determinant of what they came away from the Soviet Union with was what they thought about it before. Because while you were speaking, I was remembering how Nabokov, on coming to Cambridge, was sort of aggrieved to find the communists, the British communists he encountered, sort of just after the 1917 revolution, were quite ill-informed, according to him, and would, take the side of the USSR over, or it wasn't the USSR at that point, but the Soviets over his sort of first-hand recollections.
Yep.
And I was sort of wondering whether the trips to the USSR would have made or sort of moderated people's opinions. And for example, those who had been very pro-USSR would have come away feeling less so. Those who've been very anti would have come away from it feeling a little less anti. But it sounds like there's a much more nuance to.
There is, and it really varies. Violet Conolly is a really interesting example. She writes a book which is really quite negative about Soviet Union in many ways. It's not very few of these are completely negative or completely positive. There's a lot of nuance even in the individual's perceptions and understanding. But Violet Conolly finishes her book with a little afterwards saying, it's basically a few weeks later after I finished the draft and I've gone back over it and thought a bit harder about what I was saying. It's like, I understand that Soviet Union, it's going through a big change, and therefore there's many things that aren't perfect. And maybe I was a little bit hard on the Soviets. So there could be some nuance there. There could be some changes. The communist I mentioned, I didn't name her. She's called Miss Bartley, who Archibald Lyle met in Leningrad. Miss Bartley was a member of the CPGB, and she, from what Lyle says of her at least, appears to really have a crisis of confidence in the Soviet Union while she's there. So it wasn't the predetermination, that was there to an extent. Your political beliefs and your attitude to travel to the Soviet Union was already kind of shaped before you even went there. But experience could change things, and also at the same time, it didn't have to.
And two actually very interesting questions here. One from Peter Turner, and a related one from Ben Phillips. Hello again, Ben. You talk about romanticizing peasant life. Does that suggest that the strong sense of a city-country divide derived possibly from 19th century Russian novels, which probably many British travellers had read, as much from political suspicion of Soviet cultural diplomacy? And then Ben's question is that are these sort of continuities of the idea of the city and provincial dichotomy and the romanticization of the peasant, do they come possibly from earlier travel writing by Westerners about Russia? And is there a kind of quasi-Orientalist fascination with Russia?
I think the Orientalist fascination with Russia underpins a lot of it. Yes, I think I'll get to the Russian side rather than the Soviet side in a moment. But I think that it's really important that the Soviet side is present. It's about what the Soviets are doing. It's about how the Soviets are showing themselves. It's about the Soviet ideas. That's why a lot of people in the Soviet Union are not in Russia. They didn't visit, yes, they weren't around 20 years before necessarily, but the number of foreigners in the Soviet Union, as far as I'm aware, was, actually, I don't know if it was more than, say, the equivalent period pre-revolution, pre-World War I. But the people who went there then were going to see the Soviet. That's what they were going to do. However, yes, I think pre-revolutionary understandings of the Russian peasant and the Russian culture from literature or from elsewhere were very significant, as too, I think, probably were British understandings generated during the Industrial Revolution about the value and the virtue of the countryside over the urban sprawl. And so there's a certain middle-class snobbishness about a lot of this. Most of these travelers are middle class, not all of them, about seeking cleaner life, purer life away from the city. I'd say probably more likely, I don't know for sure, in each individual is different, more likely from British traditions than Russian, but Russian traditions no doubt played a part in that. And I think there's one of the curiosities of this is how, of course, the Bolshevik attitude to the countryside was the polar opposite of many of these travelers, and the countryside was a place of darkness and needed to be reformed. And that itself has its own Russian antecedents, of course. So I talk about that a little bit more in my thesis, and this is basically a chapter in my thesis. And there's a whole bit where I go into the Narodniki and British, understandings of the rural idyll. Joan Beecham, who was a communist, went to somewhere in Ukraine in 1933 and turned up at just so it happened at the moment of a great big parade in the village where everyone was celebrating the Red Bounty. And she compared it to merry old England. She says it's merry old England. It's the rural peasant, which never existed in England and never did exist in the Soviet Union, but that's what she reached for. It's a very complex mix, but I think Russian literature is significant here. I think the Russian populist movement is significant here. But I think more likely it's the British understanding of the countryside that's significant here. And yes, if people like Stephen Graham are involved there, I think that's key. But then also it's explicitly Soviet, not Russian. So they're there to see the Soviet. And even if they dichotomize it between Soviet and Russian, it's still there because of that. Everything is shaped by these understandings of cultural diplomacy and Soviet imperatives.
Mm-hmm. We have a comment here from Deborah Norton. So many women travelers, marvelous. That is something that stands out, actually. Is that possibly to do with, I was going to say, is it to do with the fact that many of them would have been young socialists and involved in the more women-focused movement there? But actually, this is a bit of a trend in the first half of the 20th century anyway, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. To be honest, it's not something I've dug into too much, but I feel like I should, because it is noticeable. Actually, I'd say the majority I look at are men, but there are a sizable minority of women. And actually, just so happens that their texts tend to be quite a lot more interesting in many senses. Elizabeth Delafield, in particular, is extremely reflective and self-aware about what she's doing. A lot of the travel accounts are dire. I have to say this outright. A lot of them are pretty awful, but some of them are actually really quite good pieces of writing, and hers is one of the best. And I wonder if the acknowledgement, the understanding in Britain of the Soviet Union as being a place of at least better aspirations and hopes for gender equality and for the treatment of women influenced some of these women in going. They maybe felt it was curious, interesting in that sense, to see how women lived there. And Delafield in particular is like that. She's on the farm. She's talking to women mainly. She's seeing how they lived. Ethel Manning went through the Soviet Union to Samarkand. Ada Chesterton went to Belarus. Violet Conolly. Yeah, they're actually, there's a majority of men, but a lot of the women have the more interesting books, I have to say.
There's a question here from Tilly. Are there many accounts of academic exchanges during this period, particularly scientific or medical exchanges or visits?
Oh, that I don't know about exchanges, I have to say, but there are visits. Yes, there were quite a lot of. I don't really look at them though, because they were more arranged by probably Vox, the Society for Cultural Relations with Foreign Countries. And therefore they were very much part of the Soviet apparatus in terms of inviting people over and then having symposiums with them, that kind of thing. I know that happened. And I have a book, I can't remember what it's called, by Mr. and Mrs. Davies. I can't remember their first names, I'm sorry, but he was a geologist. So he was invited over as a geologist and seemed immensely surprised to meet lots of geologists when he was in the Soviet Union. Quite a sort of lack of awareness about his role as a foreign expert. And it's a deeply uninspiring book. but that's not, I'm sure there are many, there probably are some good books about that kind of thing. I don't really know about exchanges, to be honest. I think what I would say is that it's quite clear that specialists, we'll call them, were interested in the Soviet Union. So, and they went often to look at their specialism. Be they teachers, be they miners, mining engineers. Malcolm Burr was a mining engineer. Be they agronomists, be they economists, be they industrial. Walter Citrine went, you know, he's secretary of the British TUC, general, secretary of the British TUC, and he went to explore labour conditions. That's what he was interested in. That's what his people were interested in at home. So that's what he wanted to find out about the Soviet Union. So I think there were symposiums and invitations of big groups, but I don't really look into those kinds of trips by definition, because I'm more interested in those that didn't have, you know, organised tours. But professional expertise definitely played a role in this. And of course, the Soviets invited lots of specialists over to work for them. That was a very important part of the 5-year plans.
A question here from Kathy McAteer, who gave our last talk, which is up on the Pushkin House YouTube channel now. Thank you for a fascinating talk. I'm interested to know how and where you managed to source all these travel details. Have you had to search hard in the British Library, for example, to piece it together? And are you tempted to recreate any of these particular travel experiences yourself?
That's a nice question, because I like maps and travel. Sorry, I just love that map. That's why I'm doing it. No, it's not that hard, actually. So funnily enough, in terms of, you know, the real day-to-day logistical details of like people's trips, that's quite hard to establish. I've done that with Gareth Jones. I think I know exactly where he was on any day that you like in the Soviet Union. But others not so easy. Some are quite revealing about the time they travelled and their days. Most are quite opaque, actually. But I think the most striking thing there is that just all these travel accounts are just in libraries. They're in libraries all over the country. They're not that rare. And I think they haven't really been used in this way before, which is why I find it quite interesting. So it's quite easy to determine, say, the year they visited and the time of year they visited. It's not always easy to determine exactly when, you know, which week or which day of the weekend they did something. It doesn't tend to be that important, except for someone like Gareth Jones, where the timeline becomes so specific and time sensitive, such as with his reporting of the famine. So that's been some good work to unpick that. And in terms of doing these trips myself, well, I like Russia generally, so anything really, anything.
There's quite a specific question here from Gillian Darley, but I'll read it anyway, and hopefully it's a very enlightening question as well. But I wonder if you'll be able to give us some insight on this. Wondered if you thought that different professions were guided differently. Lots of architects visited, such as Elizabeth Scott, architect of the Stratford Theatre, who went to visit her brother Humphrey, who'd lived in Moscow for 6 years. She and her doctor brother went down the Volga, as well as visiting the usual social amenities, nurseries, clinics, etc. You know, diary or other record. Were the guides able to tailor the journey for relevant interest groups? Or did the architects get special insights, or just the standard fare?
I don't know so much about this, but I think probably, yes, they did have tailored stuff. As I mentioned, that geologist, he met a lot of geologists by design. It wasn't by accident. So I'm pretty sure, yes. Vox, especially more than in tourist, that was its job, essentially court these foreigners and to create a good impression amongst them. And so show them a good time, and showing a good time to a professional, I guess, is making them talk to lots of other fellow professionals, the Soviet attitude at least. But yes, I think they probably did. I think that's how is probably specific to the individual. I'd have to go back to books like Showcasing the Great Experiment by Michael David Fox, which is a fantastic book, because he will talk about that. Ludmilla Stern in From Left Bank to Red Square as well. We'll talk about that kind of thing. There will, and there's been a lot of good research done on the Soviet institutional apparatus about this kind of stuff, and they were very attentive. They became, from the late 20s onwards, they became increasingly attentive to specific needs and engaging with foreigners in a very specific way. So I'm sure that was something they practiced.
I'll ask questions in a slightly different order than the one they've come in for now. Sure. Did anyone get to Magnitogorsk? I know there was an American there in the 30s, and if so, what did they make of it?
There was an American there in the 30s. It's John Scott. I think he worked there. Confession, I don't look at Americans and I don't look at people who worked in the Soviet Union simply because I only have so many words. One day I would love to look at everyone possible in all different contexts, because I think there's probably a lot of connected themes. None of my travellers got to Magnitogorsk, which is a shame, actually. For those who don't know, Magnitogorsk was founded at this time in the Urals as a steel city, I think. Huge project, new city out of nothing, for the industrialization process. And Stephen Kotkin wrote an amazing book called Magnetic Mountain about the founding and the functioning of the city. So no, none of my travellers did. That doesn't mean someone didn't though. And I think John Scott, who I think of John Scott, I think he worked there rather than travelled there. And whilst it's a foreigner in the Soviet Union, I feel like working there is a very different set of things, even though, as I said, there's connected themes. It's a very different set of assumptions and challenges there.
Another question from Marina here. One of my colleagues in Cambridge talked about her father being arrested in the USSR in 1935. He was working as a foreign specialist in industry. Did any more sources mention any similar experiences during their travels? Probably they did have run-ins with the authorities, right?
They did, but I think the foreign specialist, I think, again, this goes to the difference between working there and traveling there. I think if you're working there, you're probably more at risk of this kind of thing, because you're working with the nuts and bolts of Soviet aspiration in many ways, and therefore, as with the Metro Vickers engineers in 1933, who were all released, get into trouble because of, they're easier for the Soviet government to use as pawns in whatever game they're playing with, either foreign powers or internal domestic politics. However, travellers did encounter police, but what's noticeable is that really very few of them ever got into trouble about anything. Archibald Lyle was punched in the face by someone in Moscow for no apparent reason, and then set about travelling around Moscow with the police looking for his assailant. Jones ran into some police just at the end of his walk in Ukraine, and his diary, it's quite vague what he says, but they didn't arrest him or anything. They don't do anything to him. They said, I think they check his papers and say, what the hell are you doing walking through the countryside by yourself? Go to Kharkov, do what you... Jones had an invitation to the German consulate there. So I think they probably said to him, get to the German consulate, go where you're going. What are you doing out here? But he wasn't arrested, no trouble. Others were, I can't remember who, maybe it was Crichton, his papers were checked at a railway station, and, not interrogated, but questioned about, what are you doing? And then he explained what he was doing, and it was sort of, oh, on you go. John Grierson, who landed his plane in Minsk unannounced, was interrogated by the OGPU for a little bit of time, and then sent on his way because he had an invitation to go to Moscow. So they let him go. So it's quite, despite a lot of the travellers talking about the fear of the Soviet police and the danger they might be in, and relating how all their friends were saying, oh, you're going to be arrested the minute you cross the border, it didn't happen. At least in my travel, in pretty much everything I've read, it just didn't happen.
That's very interesting. Did you notice any differences in perceptions between travellers coming from different points on the left? For example, the ILP versus Communist Party of GB travellers?
That, shamefully, I cannot answer. I'm afraid I don't know. I think also most of my travellers weren't members of the CPGB or the ILP. They weren't so politically active, as it were. Some were definitely on the left, but they weren't members of parties, which is something I need to observe as a fact in and of itself, actually. But I can't answer any more than that, I'm afraid.
What did you think of the film, Mr. Jones?
I'm very pleased it was made, and I completely understand why it was made the way it was made. But I think it just from a viewer's perspective, I think its pacing was a little bit funny. It didn't quite hit home as hard as it could, I think. And in terms of its depiction of Jones's experiences in the Soviet Union, it definitely took some artistic licenses. And I think it, unfortunately, curiously as well, his journey through Ukraine in the film, if anyone's seen it, it's very, very stark and horrific and very, very violent in a sense. And curiously, they don't take the opportunity to give the Ukrainian peasants a voice, which what Jones was doing. He gave them a voice. He talked to me. His diaries are full of pages and pages and pages and pages of brilliant not brilliant, very, very interesting, very moving witnessing of something really quite significant and serious. And the film doesn't give them a voice, apart from, you know, a haunting song, which is used to sort of make the viewer feel a bit confused and sad and chilled by it, rather than sort of that these are living, breathing people. And some of them weren't living and breathing, sadly, but you get my point. It's strange. I think that was a strange choice.
Yeah, I think probably that's a sort of slight Hollywoodization of the story.
Whether and Orwell's role in the story is completely different. Anyway.
I don't see any more questions in the chat. I'll just wait and see if anybody else comes in with any more. But I think that struck me as quite well worth talking about is this idea that the real Russia or the real Soviet Union is outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg. And I think that's something that probably is an idea that exists still today. I know, I think I've only been to Moscow and Petersburg in Russia, and I do feel, okay, they were definitely in Russia, but there's a lot more there, not there. So is this sort of, I suppose the communist, the context that the travelers in this period were going in was one in which the city and the provinces were being delineated quite starkly, and that difference impacted their sort of preconceptions and their experiences. But do you think there's something in the idea that there is just something quite different between the two capitals and the rest of the country?
I'm not expert enough in broader Russian culture to say that definitively, but I suspect yes. And if I may relate it to, say, British experience, compare London to the rest of the country, there's a clear difference. And I think this is one of the interesting things about this history is the interpolation, the interweaving of, I wouldn't say everyday norms, because it's much more complex than that, but the simple fact of difference between different places. It sounds obvious, but Moscow is not a village in Ukraine. So of course there's a difference. But then you layer on top of it cultural diplomacy, you layer on top of it these competing narratives about Soviet life, you layer on top of it what it was like at different times, 1930, 1933, 1939. It's both obvious to say there's a difference, but also there's a huge amount of possibility within those differences of cultural meaning and political meaning and social meaning, which is what I explore. As I mentioned before in my answer about the 19th century Russian ideas of the countryside, there is an element, yes, of Petersburg versus Moscow. It's Petersburg against Moscow in terms of, say, broadly speaking, Slavophile Westernizer narrative in Russian history, that kind of thing. And then the cities as against, not against, but as being starkly different to the Russian Mir. That kind of thing. I don't know, though, for instance, how orthodoxy is woven between Moscow and the provinces. I suspect there's a lot of complexity there, where perhaps they're much more united. I simply don't know. Other people know far more about that than me. But yes, I think there's this sort of simple brute fact of difference. But aside that, there is quite a lot of cultural complexity based on the specific time and what was happening in the Soviet Union at the time, which has, resonances in 19th century Russian discourse as well.
Yeah, and I think what's really brilliant about this presentation that you've given and your work otherwise is the way that you show these sort of culturally specific and time specific conceptions and reasons why people write these different accounts of their travels. I'll mention a couple of comments that have just come in. Christine says that there was a group of German architects, the May group, who were recruited to help with the planning of major projects such as Magnitogorsk. A book in German by Fritz Jaspert about it. So worth checking out if you're interested in that. And in line with the sources, there are two books by Bertha Malnick, Everyday Life in Russia, 1936, and Russian Families by Pearl Binder, 1938. Both were very positive and had exciting impressions with lots of drawings as evidence. So
thank you, Maria.
Two more things to check out.
There's always more to read.
Absolutely.
Always more to read. Thank you. I'd also comment there's a great book by Kingsley Martin and Lowe. So it's called Lowe's Russian Sketchbook, where Lowe, the political cartoonist, illustrates Kingsley Martin's text about their travel around the Soviet Union. There are some good drawings around it. I mean, Hergé as well, of course.
I didn't know that Lowe had.
Yeah, mid-30s.
All right, well, brilliant. I think that's probably about all we have time for. But so thank you, Nick, very much for this talk and this Q&A. It's been absolutely fascinating. Probably this was the one of these Anglo-Russian Research Network talks that I had least familiarity with. So it's been a brilliant job of you to elucidate it and make it clear for somebody who's not an academic or an expert on this. And thank you to Anna Maslyonova and Miriam Maguire, who arranged these talks as well with the Anglo-Russian Research Network. Check them out online if you can. And I'll say that next week, I'll repeat if you weren't here earlier, next week we have Sarah Gear in the last of this series talking about the current state of Russian translations in English and the future of those. So thank you to everybody at the Anglo-Russian Research Network, and thank you to everybody who's joined today as well.
Thank you, Rafi, and thank you, everyone.
Goodbye.
Cheers. Bye.